So the first round of graduate school applications that I did, I relied very heavily on my mother. I'm very privileged in the fact that she is an academic, so she was able to give me a lot of advice. I also was really fortunate in the fact that all of the professors that offered to write me a letter of recommendation for graduate school also offered to look over all of my application materials before I sent them in. And then the second round, which led to my PhD program, I was really lucky that I had a wider network of people in the field. And so I was able to reach out to other students who were already in PhD programs for a lot of advice on how to best market yourself for doctoral programs, as well as my master's advisor also gave me a lot of advice.
When I started my master's, I honestly didn't know any other graduate students, so I felt a little underwater. I didn't know who to talk to, who was best. So I would just talk to my advisor at Fresno State and say, hey, like, what should I do? Should I go to a field school? I had no idea. I felt like I was really lost. Um, so I kind of tried to just ask around professors. There was really no colleagues or students I can ask at that time because I didn't know anybody. But by the time I got to the PhD level, it wasn't easier, but it was better in the sense that I did know more people, and I said, "Hey, how do you like your program? How do you like living there, being there? Are you being supported?" Like I can ask all these other questions that I was never able to ask before. So at first, the professors, um, and then as time progressed, I tried to ask some of the graduate students because they're pretty honest. They if they're miserable, they're going to kind of tell you, and if they're happy, they'll tell you as well, which is was awesome for me.
When I was applying for grad school, I sought advice primarily from my peers who were a year older than me, who had gone through the process, or a couple years older than me and were in other graduate programs. I also asked for help from my undergraduate advisor, um, who was my thesis advisor and the field school director of the field school I worked at. So those were kind of the people I asked. My family didn't have much experience with this, and so it was kind of up to my academic network to really answer those questions for me.
When I was applying to grad school, I asked a lot of people for their advice. Yes, I asked a lot of professors and people at my school and people who had and were working with me at that time. I asked them for their experiences and I asked them to kind of guide me in what they thought grad schools wanted because they had mostly gone through them themselves. I also actually reached out to other people in my community who had nothing to do with education. I was already conducting research at some local churches and I talked to some elders at these churches just kind of to get an idea of what was the best way of going about talking about my project. So I really had a twofold front. I had one front that was the academic side that really helped me make sure that I came across with what I needed to academically. And then I also looked for help in my research section with the people at the church and with some other people that I knew around town because I wanted to hear what non-scientific speak was when I told them what I wanted to do. I wanted to keep it accessible. And the best way to do that was to run it by someone who had no idea what anthropology really was.
So overall, my interview processes for all the schools that I applied to were quite informal, but some of them were definitely structured. For example, the professor that I was applying under would give me a schedule of which professors to talk to in like which order and where to go or which buildings to visit. And so that was super helpful in kind of like knowing what to expect. And then the other note that I wanted to add was that I already knew these professors that I was applying under. I met them before at conferences or when they came to talk or, lecture at previous institutions that I was at. So that kind of helped me ease up the tension a little.
So with Chico State, they have a conference every year, the forensic conference that they host usually at the end of October. And I had heard about it. So I actually took that opportunity to go over to Chico and introduce myself to the professors there. I recommend that, whatever school you're looking at, if they do have free events that you're able to attend, to do so. Overall, I mean, as part of the application process, they want to know that you would be able to get along with other people in that lab. You are spending tons of time with your cohort and other students. So they want to make sure everybody gets along and they're a good fit for each other. So I would say that's really important to do. So in a sense, that was a little bit of an informal interview, introducing myself. The year after, I went again, and I started becoming a face they saw, so they knew who I was and knew what I was interested in. With UC Berkeley, as I became more interested in the world of forensics and undocumented border crossers, I began to have more questions and kind of dive deeper into the theoretical implications of everything that I was looking at. Whereas with Chico, I feel like I strongly got the methodology more so. So I knew from a very early time when I was in Chico that I wanted to go to UC Berkeley and study specifically under Dr. Sabrina Agrawal. So I actually reached out really, really early to her and just said, ask questions like, what do you hope to see in your students? What kind of background, what kind of theory, what kind of methods? What is the perfect student you're looking for? And she would tell me like, oh, my students typically have X, Y, and Z. So again, this was through email. So formal/informal. But of course, once you actually apply to whichever school, whether it's your master's or PhD, typically you do have an interview, a more formal interview. So for my master's, I actually scheduled a meeting with Dr. Bartlink. I think it was the weekend of one of the conferences, so I was going to be there anyway. And he sat me down and just kind of asked me questions about myself, what I wanted to study, what I'm interested in, what I've done before, things like that. So I was prepared in a sense, you know your own history. But something I definitely recommend is also knowing the work that professor does or that school has done in general, because it will show how interested you are and invested you are in that specific program. So same thing happened with UC Berkeley. I had a more formal interview where I went to actually meet in person. So it was a combination of emails and sit-down interviews for both.
I did a Zoom interview because I was in Mexico City, and my advisor was in Dunedin in New Zealand, and he had already posted the idea for the project that I was going to be working on that I was interested in doing because of my background, and so we really just talked about that project. Johnny Gieber, who is my advisor, his background is in looking at the Irish famine, people who died during the Irish famine, and so he just wanted to know if I had experience with the methodology that he wanted me to use. He wanted someone to look at the bone histology of the skeletons that he had already done the paleopathology on. And so we just talked about that. We talked about my previous experience with bone histology. We talked about my master's project and another paper that I had written during my master's. And it was really informal. He just asked me a couple questions about my background and some ideas that I had for the project, which I had prepared ahead of time. And it was fairly short and sweet. I think it was maybe about 15 minutes long. This was after I had already sent in my application, and then there was not a follow-up interview, so it was just that one interview. And then I found out fairly shortly afterwards, he emailed me to let me know that he was interested in bringing me on, and then we started the formal process of bringing me into the program.